So the question, especially over this Ukraine crisis, has recently again raised the serious question of, do we actually need an EU army? Now, of course, during the 2016 referendum campaign, the whole alarm bell was sounded about by the Brexiteers saying, oh my God, they're going to create an EU army. Oh my God, it's going to be an EU army. It's going to be based on conscription. And oh my God, it's going to be a nightmare. But bear in mind, um, most European countries now do not have conscription. Most of them haven't had it for at least, you know, maybe like 15 or 20 years ago. So it's really no longer applicable. But of course, they forget, of course, that we too had conscription. It was just called national service. Again, it wasn't so. Again, it was the quote nice way of saying conscription. But they also forget, of course, that going back even further than that, we used to have to pay a naval tax. And this was, again, spun to the British public at that time as saying, instead of having conscription, you'll pay 5% extra, and that's the naval tax. That's instead of having conscription. And that's what people were at the time very happy to pay, because, again, it's either that or conscription. And that's how it was sold at the time to people. So this whole idea of, oh, Britain's never had conscription. Yes, we have had conscription in the past. We just changed its name to national service. But yes, this whole idea of an EU army is definitely going to come up again. And I think we are certainly possibly might even see it as a way to help us out in this situation, especially with Germany increasing its defense budget. We've already seen bills in the EU, which weren't, again, to create an EU army. It was, again, to enable cooperation with different armed forces so that they could, within the EU, collaborate with each other a lot more easier. That's what it really was. It wasn't creating an EU army, but now there is a very good chance to say, and a good argument to say, well, actually, should we have an EU army? So let's go diving into this question, because I think it's a very valid question to actually ask now. So, as before we get into this, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and one donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help support the channel that way. And of course, thank you very much for everyone for tuning in, as always. So let's jump into this. This comes from the New European, the title of A Force for Good. So, did we need an EU army after all? Europe has started even in itself with its very muscular response to Europe has startled even itself with its very muscular response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and the consequences may be far-reaching. Even its biggest fans know that they're in their secret hearts that the European Union can be a very sluggish beast, slowly tumbling towards a consensual action. But in this crisis, the response has been swift, firm, and decisive. It is still early days, but for once, it is more than measuring up to the task. Europe seems to have found its mojo. The European project, founded with an explicit aim of, according to one of its architects, Robert Schulman, of making war between France and Germany not merely unthinkable, but entirely impossible. It is attempting to make this once unthinkable war in Europe so unpalpable that it is impossible to continue. Something, of course, has snapped. The European community has long been considered, as one of Belgian foreign minister put it, an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military worm. It is just possible that the worm has finally turned. Its main players themselves, rather than communicators who are literally falling over themselves to use words and phrases that suggest this vast Teutonic shifts, are now underway. The talk of the watershed moments, turning points, taboos broken, and of course Rubicons crossed. The purpose is certain, but the destination is less clear. If this new self-confidence endures and is bound to build up European military muscles, but what will that strengthen the hand of, and for whose strategic autonomy? For those reading for something of independence from the US, or its polar opposite, tightening the screws that bind the transatlantic alliance in NATO. When we were still members, of course, in the EU, nothing would bring on the Eurosceptic apoplectic quicker than the frequent headlines in the Daily Express and the Daily Telegraph suggesting a European army. This was just around the corner, marching into beginning. These were usually very silly scare stories based on, of course, the very titchy moves towards a bit more cooperation. But this is often forgotten that the aspiration for Europe to have its very own military force was once central to that very project. The what if questions might be, of course, historically pointless, but they are intriguing all the same. If the Treaty of Paris had been signed by the six founding nations 70 years ago, rather than the makeshift compromise called the Treaty of Rome, would Russia have dared invaded Ukraine? For the European Economic Community, the common market was very much a second beast, an attempt to try and make up for the momentum after the failure of a movement of a very ambitious project that would have been given a six real military clout. The European political community posed in 1952 that what would have created the political framework for a very unambiguous superpower. The plan was that the infirm coal and steel community would have joined with the newly created European army, and France would contribute about 14 divisions, 750 aircraft, Italy 12 divisions, and 450 warplanes, and West Germany with just an air force. Both the coal and steel community of the new common European defence force would have been governed by a brand new body and the European political community. But, of course, the French stopped this plan in its tracks. The National Assembly said no, and the party, because of Gaulle's fears about losing sovereignty. De Gaulle, of course, still out of power, warned the French politicians that they were about to deliver a very fatal blow to France and to its unity and to that of the French Union, the entire post-empire equivalent, of course, of the British Commonwealth. Rather oddly, he did claim that this fatal wound would prevent the birth of a true European unity. And in many ways, de Gaulle's concerns do reflect those of the UK later on. The difference was that he would only allow the project to proceed if he was certain that France was in the driving seat and the destination was enhanced by French power. In the end, of course, it was not France that suffered the final blow, but the Treaty of Paris, which had been created this invasion. With the French refusing to join and the four countries that had already signed up, the Italians pulled out too. The world would be a far different place if the initials of the ECP did tipped off lightly to our tongues instead, and progressed to the end of the goal of the political Europe that had been reached in baby steps. Although these arguments, of course, the British did remain on the sidelines, dripping in contempt and disdain and shot through with a very insecure alarm at a possible new potent power and a strategic rival. Still, the British civil servants judged the next destination for a conference in Messina in Sicily, the devilishly awkwardly place expected for a minister to get, thus not worth even attending. So when the UK did eventually join the organisation founded in Messina, the common market, the French found not only an ally in opposition to the creation of a European military force, but strategic rivals with a very different vision. The two European imperial nuclear powers had mirror image objections to the development of a coherent foreign and defence policy for Europe. De Gaulle fettered that the French were not equal partners in NATO and with the Anglo-Saxons, and left his country hanging for more than halfway outside of that alliance. It did not again fully rejoin until 2009. The Brits, on the other hand, were worried that any sign of European defence cooperation was an assault on their sovereignty and, of course, NATO's primacy. Strange that those obsessed with a competent underhanded sovereignty, the main worry was that it would obviously finally undermine the special relationship that offered the US. And of course, add to that the potent mix of the albatross of the war guilt hanging around Germany's neck, and of course, any momentum was bound to be hit by buffers. It was very little surprise that the Brits, who again fretted about the development of a superstate, a United States of Europe, came out in cold sweat at the very thought of the possibility of a European army. When there was also a constant nostalgia about some of the trappings of statehoods like flags, anthems, and a constitution that critics could point out as the football clubs, automobile associations, the limited companies have variations on very much all of these adornments. On the whole, why don't they have armed forces? Not for nothing does one early Chinese name for their country include the ideograms for mouth and the dagger and axe, implying the defense of the people. It is one of the defining jobs of a nation to defend its territory and its citizens. For those concerned that the EU was again going to swoop down and annex this critical national function, needn't have worried too much. Back in 2018, as back in 2008, as again the BBC's European editor put it, I was the eyewitness to the Operation European Endeavour, a 1,500 strong multinational European battle group that had been deployed to defend the newly elected government of Vilnius under attack from a neighbouring nuclear superpower. But pirates and, of course, the local militia, the razor wire, and the soldiers cradling automatic weapons ringed around a compound of air-cordoned tents inside the focused, and men and women in camouflage pointed at very large-scale maps tipped out on orders to their computers, and aircraft violating EU airspace was intercepted and its occupants then taken prisoner. And of course, like Vilnius, this was all make-believe, a test of command and control functions with no real troops to control, no actual fighter jets to command. The battle groups were in and very, very much real enough, but a promise of their regular deployment once the Lisbon Treaty was done and dusted proved just another myth. 2 battalions were always on standby, but by this day they have never ever been deployed. Given that the main aim was again to foster cooperation between nations, each battle group was made up of soldiers from at least 2 countries, except one, rather comically, the British agreed to set up a battle group made up of only British soldiers so that no one could claim they were under the command of foreigners, even though this is common in NATO. The US did seem relaxed about this parallel track. I was told that if you want something done, then a lot of furniture needs to be broken down, then you do need NATO. But not everything needs furniture to be broken down, and sometimes it's possible to do something with this sort of force at an early stage and before you need to break a lot of furniture. And of course, times have changed. Brexit removed this big stumbling block, and the UK's ironclad opposition to anything that sounded like a European army. It was not long ago, 2019 in fact, when Emmanuel Macron felt free to riff on de Gaulle's old dream of a French imperial glory, revisiting its pan-colonial purpose, unshackled from the unreliable Anglo-Saxon allies across the bodies of the water, the great and small. He described NATO as brain-dead and scornfully dismissed the then German defense minister view in the US of Europe's most important ally. He said Europe needed to build up its own autonomy and sovereignty in defense. Her response to strategic autonomy was a non-starter. The contours, of course, of this dispute do remain, but much has changed. For some time, Germany has been slowly resuming the shape of a normal nation, not haunted by its terrible past, but it is a cold shock of the new war with an uncanny historical echoes that has led to this government's new shed in its inhibitions to pump at least 100 billion euros into the special fund for new ships, aircraft, and better trained soldiers. The impoverished and undervalued Bundeswehr is to be transformed into something like a modern fighting machine. After years of American nagging, NATO's again, Europe's richest country will finally hit NATO's spending target it set 8 years ago. Angela Merkel's very much untested replacement, Olaf Scholz, stepped up to the plate, saying, "We need to invest considerably in more of our security for our country in order to defend our liberty and our democracy." The EU has, again, very various exotic intentions at its disposal if it wants to beat up the bare bones in its cooperation for something more of the furniture-breaking capabilities. The military and the EU already share one thing, a donation of acronyms, and that is the rule of thumb. More than anybody, to the sound of the delay they are already retooled to one such project. The European Peace Facility, designed with Africa in mind, will be used to buy at least an extra 500 million euros worth of arms to help Ukraine. And of course, then there's the Permanent Security Cooperation, the defence initiative that includes all EU countries bar Malta and Denmark at the heart of its plans to develop the further instruments for modern warfare. Whatever these mechanisms, there is political will when it manufactures. The nations on the EU's eastern flank, traditionally cautious about further integration, even more nervous about forced integration at the hands of their old masters in Moscow. There is again a very significant change of tune. The Polish Prime Minister's Markus Morawiecki, if that's how you say it, has said that the EU needs to build a very strong army that would be integrated into NATO. Only this can make the EU a global player. Only this will make us safe. And everyone, even a very senior advisor to Hungary's autocratic leader Viktor Orban, has been quoted by saying that the EU is currently caught between Russia and the US. Without a military, Europe is just a voice accepting statements, and it is just nothing. The recent spats between Macron and the Germans over the relationship with NATO may seem to belong to a remote and irrelevant past, but they are very, very stiff on for a future debate. There are also very likely to be profound questions for the UK, torn between the smoke separation of a practical desire to have a piece of the action, if only in terms of defence contracts. But perhaps some differences will dissolve by the heat generated by a war in the neighbourhood. After all, with the European army may back on the table, NATO may be immeasurably strengthened. Its primacy and original Cold War purpose has been underpinned, the value of Article 5 underscored. The West's ability and shaky solidarity has found new solidarity, and one those aloof from the alliance, the Swedes and the Finns, are now showing an interest in joining. For the first time ever, a poll in Finland shows over 53% majority in favour and only 19% in outright opposition. The strategic autonomy may lead to some heady sense of freedom to a task of fighting African pirates, but it does look less clear than going nose to nose with a nuclear armed dictator. Some illusions have been blasted away by the Russian bombs. An existing alliance reaffirmed by a tooled up EU may prove to be essential, although others prefer to be bound by query of its more aggressive posturing than to what Europe was designed for. Almost inclusively rush of solidarity and rush to revolution at the Russian front is bound and afraid at the edges. Some will question if Europe really should wish to look like more other world actors and less than its better self. One of the Union's architects, Jack Morin, predicted Europe will be forged in crisis. And he was technically right. But it is worth remembering that he also said it will be the sum of all solutions adopted for those crises. But be careful what you wish for. It may be that crisis that is pregnant with a very different sort of union. So I think this is again a very valid question, obviously, to be asking at this time, whether it is right to have a EU army. And I think these questions are right to be had, and the discussion, of course, is right to be very much had, I think, in Europe. I think we will probably see this go in that direction. I can't see us not going in that direction. But of course, this has been, again, I've done two very long ones recently. I'll try to keep the next one short. But yes, as always, thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button on your way out. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, one donation link called Buy Me Coffee, etc., etc. You know the drill by now. So, as of course, thank you very much for watching. And of course, we'll see you all next time.